They called our grief a weapon. We learned to aim it. The city had been theirs for 11 years. That was how long it took humanity to stop calling it an occupation and start calling it what it was, the end. The Vareth had not arrived with warships or ultimatums. They had arrived with silence, a single vessel, perfectly spherical, settling into low orbit above the Pacific like a drop of mercury balanced on a fingertip. Then the spheres had come down, thousands of them, iridescent and slow-moving, drifting through the upper atmosphere like jellyfish through dark water. Scientists had called them probes. Diplomats had called them an opening gesture. Generals had called them a threat assessment tool. Everyone had been right in a way that made all of them useless. The spheres rewrote physics wherever they settled. Not everywhere, just in the cities, just in the places that mattered. In Seoul, time slowed near the Han River until clocks ran 3 seconds behind, and no one could explain why satellites no longer tracked the bridge's exact position. In Mumbai, certain frequencies of sound had simply ceased to exist, leaving a hole in the auditory spectrum where music used to live. In Sao Paulo, water refused to drain. It pooled on surfaces, climbed walls, collected in ceiling corners like something had forgotten which way was down. In what remained of Tokyo, gravity had become a suggestion. Kale understood the physics by now. He understood them the way you understood a chronic illness. Not because it made you feel better, but because ignorance was just a different kind of pain. The Vareth spheres operated through something the researchers aboard the Yamashiro called resonance inversion. They found the frequency at which a natural force operated and introduced a sustained countersignal, like a tuning fork held against another tuning fork until the second one stopped vibrating. The sphere above the old Sumida district had been running its inversion field for 11 years. 11 years of countersignal. The Kanto Plains' gravitational coherence was now somewhere between 40 and 60% of baseline, depending on the hour, the weather, and factors that Mako still could not fully model despite 4 years of trying. What that meant practically was that buildings floated. Parts of them, at least. Sections where the sphere's influence was strongest could drift upward until they reached the altitude where the field weakened, then hover. Tokyo looked like a city that had been shaken inside a snow globe and never allowed to settle. Elevated highways coiled through midair. Apartment towers leaned at angles that should have been catastrophic. The river had fragmented into levels, water flowing in 3 distinct horizontal sheets separated by air gaps that nothing heavy enough to fall could cross without assistance. It meant you could jump from one floating platform to another if you knew the drift patterns, if you were fast enough. If you were insane enough. Most of the old population had evacuated within the first 6 months. The Vareth had not prevented this. They seemed indifferent to human movement, interested only in the inversion fields themselves. The bureaucrats in Osaka called it a containment zone. The military called it denied territory. The several hundred people still living inside the bubble called it home because they were the ones who had nowhere else to go. Kale had been 8 years old when the sphere came down. His mother had taken him to the audiologist in Chiyoda-ku on the morning it happened. Auditory processing disorder. The word she kept repeating in the waiting room. Quiet and careful, like she was testing how they felt in her mouth. He'd been watching the receptionist's fish tank when the light went wrong. Not dark, wrong, like the photons themselves had hesitated. Then the sound hit. A frequency so low it wasn't sound at all. More like the concept of pressure. The idea of compression, and every piece of glass in the building had turned to powder in the same instant. He remembered floating. He remembered the absence of weight being the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to him, more terrifying than the collapse around him because his body had no language for it. He remembered a sound, not the catastrophic roar of the building failing, not the screaming, something underneath all of it. A single clear tone, like a finger run around the rim of a crystal glass. He had reached for it the way a drowning person reaches for light. He did not remember being saved. He had a scar along his left forearm and 3 missing teeth that grew back wrong, and a memory that stopped at the moment of the tone and resumed 4 days later in a triage center outside Kawasaki. The audiologist's office had been in the building that went down first. They had found 17 survivors in the rubble. His mother had not been one of them. He was 19 now. He had been in the bubble for 11 years. He could navigate the drift patterns of the flooded Sumida quarter in complete darkness by feel alone, and he could clear a 6-meter gap between unstable platforms at altitude without breaking stride. and he was still the only person he had ever met who could hear the tone. It came and went. Mostly it stayed quiet, a low hum just below the level of conscious hearing, like tinnitus with a purpose. Some days it was louder, when the sphere pulsed, when the inversion field cycled through one of its irregular intensity spikes, when the weather changed. On those days, Kale had to retreat to the lowest levels of the city, deep in the flood layers where the sound propagation was different, and press his back against submerged concrete and breathe through his teeth until it faded. His team thought it was migraines. He had never corrected them. The Vareth didn't communicate through frequencies humans could hear. Everyone knew that. The resonance inversion fields operated across a spectrum that topped out below the threshold of human perception. There was nothing to hear. The researchers aboard the Yamashiro had 17 different instruments that all confirmed this. Kale heard it anyway. Team Blue Actual had 5 members and operated out of a converted river barge they called the Anchor, moored in a flooded district 3 kilometers south of the sphere's base coordinates. Their mission brief, technically, was reconnaissance and resource acquisition, terms that meant different things to the military command in Osaka than they meant inside the bubble. Osaka thought they were a forward intelligence team, mapping the sphere's operational parameters and identifying weaknesses in the Vareth's field maintenance schedule. Inside the bubble, they were the people who won the races. The races had started as survival. 2 years in, when it became clear that the Vareth were not going to leave and not going to destroy what remained, and not going to make any demands that humanity could understand or refuse, the people inside the bubble had started competing for resources. Not violently, or not usually, but through the only currency the broken physics had introduced, speed and nerve. If you could navigate the drift faster than anyone else and get your flag to a contested supply cache first, it was yours. Clean rules, clean outcomes. The violence was the environment, not each other. Osaka watched the races with something between contempt and fascination. They sent supplies to the cache sites. They monitored the teams. They called it maintaining human presence in denied territory and filed quarterly reports about it. What they actually did was watch a handful of orphans become the most precisely calibrated physical specimens alive and feel relieved that someone else was solving the problem of what to do about Tokyo. The day everything changed started the same way most days started, with KL doing something his team leader had explicitly told him not to do. The tone had been building for 48 hours. Not the usual background hum, something active, a pull like a current beneath still water. Kale had barely slept. He'd been eating protein rations mechanically and staring at the Anchor's ceiling, while the rest of the team argued about the Red Line crew's new gear. Some kind of military-grade harness system that gave them 50% more lateral stability in the drift zones, which wasn't supposed to be possible on civilian supply networks, but clearly was. Which meant Osaka was playing favorites, and that was going to become a problem in 3 days when the next flag race was scheduled. He'd slipped off the barge at Zo 300. The tone was coming from the tower. Tokyo Tower, or what remained of it, stood at the epicenter of the sphere's influence, partially collapsed, wrapped in accumulated bubbles that had compacted against it over the years like barnacles on a hull. The top third had sheared off in the first week, and now floated independently, a lacework of orange steel hanging 600 meters above the tower's broken stump, rotating 1 full revolution every 4 hours. You could see it from anywhere in the bubble. Some people found it beautiful. Kale found it unbearable to look at, because looking at it while the tone was active felt like pressing a bruise, specific pain, productive, wrong to stop. He crossed 4 drift gaps and climbed 2 floating highway sections, and crossed the upper flood layer on a repurposed surfboard before the water started resisting him. That was new. The water near the tower's base was usually sluggish. The inversion field was strongest here, and fluid dynamics went sideways in interesting ways, but it moved. This didn't move. Kale stepped off the surfboard onto what felt like solid ground, and looked down to find his feet on the water's surface, the water dense and still, and somehow load-bearing. He took another step. Another. The tone was very loud now. Not painful. The opposite of painful, which was somehow worse, because the absence of pain in a place that should have hurt felt like the start of something he couldn't name. He was 30 meters from the tower's base when she surfaced. Not from the water exactly, through it. She came up through the surface the way light comes through glass. A change in the medium, not a breach of it. And she was made of something that wasn't flesh and wasn't light and wasn't the iridescent material of the spheres, but shared properties with all three. She had the approximate shape of a young woman. She had eyes the color of the inversion field on overcast days, a gray that bent toward blue depending on how she moved. She was looking at him with an attention that felt like being read. He stood very still. The tone resolved, for the first time in 11 years, into something that might have been music. He said stupidly, "I can hear you." She tilted her head. The gesture was almost human. Not learned human, the way people who had grown up isolated sometimes wore body language at a slight angle, something else. Like the concept of curiosity finding the nearest available physical expression. She made a sound. Not language. The same tone he'd been hearing his whole life, shaped differently. A question. "Yeah," he said. "I don't know why either." He brought her back to the anchor. He told himself this was a tactical decision. An entity connected to the Varith sphere was a significant intelligence asset. He told himself this so fully and carefully that he almost believed it had nothing to do with the fact that the tone had gone quiet the moment she looked at him, and his head had stopped hurting for the first time in 11 years. Sergeant Reiko Tane was the team's second-in-command, a former JSDF combat engineer who had made the structural mistake of being inside the bubble on a survey mission when the sphere's intensity spiked and knocked out every extraction vehicle simultaneously. She had stayed out of pragmatism, and then out of something else she didn't discuss. She assessed the entity with the detached precision of someone who had learned that strong emotional responses to novel combat situations were a resource expenditure that rarely paid off. "It came out of the water," she said. "Through the water," KL said. "You're drawing a distinction I'm not sure is meaningful. The water was solid, load-bearing. Then she was there." Reiko looked at the entity. KL had already stopped thinking of her as an entity, which was its own kind of problem, who was sitting on a storage locker near the port rail and watching the bubble city with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Does Kai know you took a solo excursion to the tower at 0300? "Kai's going to know in about 4 minutes when he comes out for his morning check. I'd like to have a plan before that happens. The plan should probably include not introducing him to an alien we just fished out of the water. Through the water. Kale. She can hear the resonance field," he said. "Not detect it. Hear it. Like I can. I don't know what that means, but I don't think we should." The hatch opened. Kai stepped out, coffee in one hand and a situation report in the other, and stopped when he saw the entity sitting on his storage locker, examining a carabiner clip with the focused attention of someone who had just discovered that tools existed. His name was Kaido Mura. He had been 8 years old when the bubble came down, 2 years older than Kale, and he had been on the outside during the evacuation and had come back in on a JSDF supply run 6 months later and refused to leave. He led Blue Actual with a precision that tended to manifest as controlled frustration, because leading a team that included KL Ando required constant management of the gap between what KL was capable of and what KL believed the rules applied to him. He looked at the entity. He looked at KL. He looked at the entity again. "Start talking," he said. What followed was 4 days of carefully contained chaos. Mako, Dr. Makoto Fufuruhara, their embedded researcher, a civilian with the worst survival instincts and the best analytical mind that Osaka had ever accidentally deployed into a combat zone, began the process of building a communication framework with the entity on the second day. She was methodical and patient and consistently awed in a way she tried to suppress and failed. The entity absorbed language at a rate that wasn't physically possible for anything with a brain structure Mako could model. By the end of day 1, she had a working vocabulary of 300 words. By the end of day 2, she could construct conditional sentences. On the morning of the third day, she told them her name was not a name but a frequency, and that KL's name for her was close enough to function, and KL had not yet told anyone that he'd called her anything. Her name was now Uta. She knew what she was only in the way that a river knows it is water. The knowledge was structural rather than reflective. She was part of the inversion field. She had always been part of the inversion field. She had become something else on the day the field first activated, when the resonance had touched something specific and complex and the feedback had created, in her words, translated slowly, carefully, with Mako's help, a shape that wanted to listen. What she had been listening to for 11 years was Kyle. Not Kyle specifically, not the person, the frequency. The auditory processing disorder that made him sensitive to sounds outside the normal human range had made him, inadvertently, the only person in the bubble who could interact with the field at the level where she existed. His presence at the tower as an 8-year-old child, already tuned to that frequency by biology and then by grief. His mother's voice, which he would never hear again, gone 2 seconds after the field activated, had created something in the field's structure. A resonance echo. The field had remembered him the way a struck bell remembers the striker. She had followed that echo for 11 years. She had saved him once when the building fell. She had been trying to reach him ever since. He sat with this information for a long time on the 4th night, on the barge's stern with the flooded city spread out around him, and the sphere cycling through its midnight intensity peak overhead. She sat beside him, but not touching. Touching him created a feedback response in her material structure that she was managing carefully, the way you manage standing too close to a heat source. She had explained this without embarrassment. There was a directness to her that came from having been, until recently, a phenomenon rather than a person. She hadn't yet developed the human habit of softening facts that were inconvenient. "You could have just," he started. "No," she said. Her spoken language was still slightly formal, built from Mako's careful instruction. "I didn't have shape, I had direction. Shape came later. When I understood what I was following." "When did you understand?" She was quiet for a moment. In the flood layer below the barge, something large moved. A carp that had adapted to the broken physics over 11 years, its swim bladder recalibrated to the reduced gravity, its movements languid and enormous in the dark water. "When you stopped being afraid of the sound," she said. "You started listening for it. That's different from being afraid of it." He had no answer for that. In the morning, Osaka called. The Red Line crew, Team Scarlet in official designations, the 5-person unit with the new harnesses, and what Reiko increasingly suspected was active military support in violation of the bubble's informal governance structure, had filed a grievance with the Coordinating Council. Blue Actual had been observed introducing an unregistered entity into the bubble's residential zone. This violated 3 different protocols. Osaka wanted an explanation. The Coordinating Council wanted Blue Actual's flag racing license suspended pending review. The Red Line crew specifically wanted the upcoming resource race canceled and the cash divided by the existing standings. Kai summarized the situation in the brief, precise way he summarized situations that made him want to put his fist through a wall. "So either we register her officially," KL said, "and Osaka gets involved at a level we can't control, or she races," Kai said. Everyone looked at him. "She's part of this team now. She races. We win the cash. The council backs down because the council always backs down when we win." He looked at Uda. "Can you navigate drift gaps?" She had been watching the exchange with the focused interest she brought to everything novel. "I don't know what my body does under competitive conditions," she said. "I've never had competitive conditions." "Outstanding," said Shin from the corner where he'd been quiet. Shinta Oda was their oldest member, 31, a former competitive parkour athlete who had come into the bubble as a volunteer rescue worker in year 2, taken a fall that had left him with a titanium lower leg assembly and a permanent slight hitch in his gait, and stayed because leaving felt like abandonment. He was the one who had found Kyle living alone in an abandoned train station at age 9 and brought him to the barge. He had the precise, considering humor of someone who had long since made peace with circumstances he couldn't change. "Our secret weapon is an 11-year-old alien who's never raced before and doesn't know what her body does." "She's been navigating the field for 11 years, KL said. "That's not the same as, she walked on water last Tuesday. She navigated from the tower's base to this barge through the densest drift zone in the bubble without any instruction and without any of the field maps we spent 4 years building." He looked at Shin. "She doesn't need to learn the physics. She is the physics." Shin looked at Uta. Uta looked back at him with the clear, assessing attention she gave to everything, and then she looked at his leg, the titanium assembly visible below his rolled-up trouser leg, and then back at his face. "Your gait compensation is efficient," she said. "Most people favor the organic side you've learned to center through the joint." Shin was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Took about 2 years. I think," Uta said carefully, "that I would like to learn to race." She learned in 6 days. What Kale had said about her relationship to the physics was true but incomplete. She didn't move through the drift zones the way the rest of them moved, calculating drift rates, timing jumps to hit platforms at the peak of their oscillation cycle, reading the air pressure differentials that indicated where the field was weakest, and therefore where gravity was most reliable. She didn't calculate. She felt the field the way you feel the rhythm in a song you know well enough to move to without thinking. Her body found the paths that the field's topology made possible, and she ran them the way water runs downhill, inevitably, without effort, as if the question of how had been answered before it was asked. The rest of them spent 6 days not being able to look away. Kale had grown up running these courses. He was the best in the bubble. Everyone acknowledged this even when they resented it. His style was angular and improvised, built on a foundation of absolute physical confidence and a sensitivity to air pressure changes that came from the same neural wiring that let him hear the tone. He could read a drift shift 30 seconds before it happened because his body registered the precursor vibrations that everyone else's didn't. He had always thought of this as his edge. Watching Uda navigate the same gaps he navigated felt like watching someone play a piece of music he'd been picking out by ear all his life and discovering that what he'd been doing wasn't the melody. He didn't resent it. He thought about why he didn't resent it and couldn't entirely work it out, except that it had something to do with the tone being quiet and his head not hurting, and something he was carefully not naming. The race was set for 3 days after Osaka's call. Standard parameters, 5-on-5 across the Sumida drift zone, flag capture. First team to return with the flag wins the cache. The cache was 6 weeks of high-protein rations, 3 water filtration units, and a box of medical supplies that Reiko had confirmed contained the specific antibiotic they needed for Shin's leg implant maintenance. This was not a discretionary race. The Red Line crew showed up in their new harnesses, and with an attitude that KL had encountered before. The specific confidence of people who had received external support and were waiting for the moment when that support became undeniable. Their leader was a 22-year-old named Daisuke, who had been in the bubble for 2 years and treated it like a proving ground rather than a home, which Kyle found harder to explain than it should have been why that bothered him. What nobody knew until the starting signal was that the harnesses weren't just stability assists. They were active. Something in their architecture interfaced with the drift field and smoothed it, giving the Red Line runners a localized area of normalized gravity that traveled with them. It wasn't flying, it wasn't exactly cheating. It was the kind of thing that was technically within the race parameters, because the parameters had been written when no one had access to active field interface technology, except the Verath. And until last week that was still true. Kale hit the first drift gap and felt the wrongness of it immediately. The platform he was targeting had shifted, not its natural drift cycle, something external. The field was responding to the Red Line harnesses. The localized normalization they generated was creating pressure waves in the surrounding field, destabilizing platforms that had been predictable for years. The course had changed. Everything he knew about it was partly wrong. He landed badly. Corrected, kept moving. Looked back to find Uda 3 meters behind him and moving smoothly and effortlessly despite the destabilized field, and understood. The field was responding to the harnesses, which meant the harnesses were broadcasting at a frequency the field could register, which meant Uda could hear them the way she heard everything else. He caught her eye. She nodded once, small and certain. She could hear the interference pattern the harnesses were creating. She could navigate it the way she navigated everything. They lost 3 members in the first 6 minutes, not to falls, to the destabilization, platforms shifting unpredictably, drift gaps that expanded before they could be cleared. Reiko made a controlled descent into the flood layer. Mako, who raced badly and had always raced badly, but refused to not race on principle, missed a jump and caught an emergency rope and swung herself to a stable platform and held position. Shin read the field shifts later than he usually did because the interference pattern was outside his experience, and took a recovery jump that landed him lower than he'd targeted. And from there, the geometry didn't work. It was KL and Uta against 5. What happened next was the thing that KL would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately. He had been racing for 10 years. He knew what it felt like to run a course well. The flow state, the moment when calculation stopped and pattern recognition took over and you were just responding, ahead of the moment instead of in it. He had reached that state hundreds of times. It was his state. It was the thing that made him good. Running alongside Uta through the destabilized course was different. She was in the field the way he was in the flow state, and when he was close to her, the tone aligned between them like two tuning forks finding each other across a room, and he found himself reading the field at a depth he had never accessed alone, not hearing her thoughts, not sharing perception. Something simpler and stranger, their individual sensitivities to the field's frequency adding together in a way that neither of them had alone. He knew where the platforms were going to be, not approximately, exactly. They cleared the back half of the course in 4 minutes. The Red Line runners had the flag site secured, 3 of them holding position at the cache point while 2 ran interference. Kale went high, Uda went low. The Red Line runners turned to track him, and she was through the middle gap and at the flag site before anyone had processed that the threat wasn't where they'd been watching. She stood at the flag site with the flag in her hand and the inversion field cycling through her in visible waves, light bending around her slightly, the way light bends around very hot air. The Red Line runners looked at her. She looked back at them with the clear, patient attention she brought to everything. She said quietly, "This belongs to them." They didn't contest it. On the walk back, Shin met them at the lower flood zone. He was wet to the waist from landing in the flood layer, and his artificial leg was making a faint grinding sound it didn't usually make, the salt water infiltration that the medical supplies would fix. And he was grinning with the specific grin of someone who had been watching from below and seen everything. "The part in the middle," he said, "where you went high and she went low." "Yeah," Kale said. "Did you plan that?" Kale thought about it. "Sort of." Shin looked at Uda, who was examining the flag with the same attention she brought to carabiners and fish and titanium leg assemblies. "You're going to be insufferable now," he told her. "Both of you, I want that noted." She looked up. Her expression was still learning human. The components were there, but the assembly was slightly her own, a smile that contained something underneath it that no template would have put there. "Noted," she said. The night after the race was when Kale told her about his mother. He didn't plan it. He was in the forward section of the barge working on a field map update, and she came and sat across from him and watched him work, and he started talking, and he talked for a long time about the audiologist's office and the fish tank, and the wrong color light and the absence of weight, and the tone, and the 4 missing days and the triage center, and the wrong growing teeth, and a woman whose voice he could still reconstruct in precise detail, but whose face was becoming harder to hold on to. Uda listened. She didn't try to repair any of it. She had been, until recently, a phenomenon. She had no instinct to manage other people's pain into more manageable shapes. She just listened with her full attention, which was not a small thing. When he stopped talking, she said, she would have heard it too. If she'd been at the tower. Heard what? What I sound like. The sensitivity runs in. She paused, reaching for the word. Family lines. He sat with that for a while. Was it you? He said. When the building fell, yes. Why? I don't know why I first heard you. Your frequency was there, and the field registered it, and the field had just become something that could register things, and... She stopped, tried again. I don't know why some sounds are beautiful. I know that yours was. He was not a person who cried easily. He had grown up in the bubble, and the bubble required a particular economy of emotion. But something had been held for 11 years, and was no longer being held, and he let that happen without apology, and she sat with him while it did. What she told him, later, in pieces, in halting translation across the gap between what she knew and what human language could carry. She was made of the field, and the field was Vareth origin, but she was not Vareth. She was the field's own response to something it had encountered. She was the thing that happened when a physical force of enormous power and alien design touched a consciousness just different enough to respond at the right frequency. She was, in the framework of the fairy tale Mako had taught her from a water-damaged paperback on the second day. Mako's way of giving her a map for what she was, something like a daughter. Of the sea, not the dry land. Capable of the surface, but not native to it. She did not tell him what it cost her to maintain shape. He figured it out on the 14th day when she reached for the flag map he was showing her, and their fingers touched for less than a second, and her arm went translucent to the elbow. She had it back in 3 seconds. She was matter-of-fact about it. The interface isn't stable, she said. It stabilizes. How long has that been happening? Since I took shape, since. He put the map down. Every time we touch, it's manageable. That's not an answer to that question. It's the answer to the important question. She looked at him directly, with the clear field gray eyes. I'm not asking you to manage it differently. I'm asking you to let me. He understood then what she was not saying. The shape cost her. Every moment of shape cost her. The field wanted her back. The way a river wants its water back. The way the field wanted everything in the bubble back. The way 11 years of inversion was an argument toward entropy. She was sustaining herself against that pull entirely on the strength of whatever had been created between them on the day a building fell and a tone found a listener. He wanted to tell her to go back. He wanted to tell her it wasn't worth it. He knew she would simply look at him with the patient, direct attention and say something like, "That is your assessment, not mine." On the 17th day, the field spiked. It was not a routine intensity cycle. Mako had the readings on her instruments before the sound hit, not the tone, something else. The field cycling at a frequency that made the barge's hull plates vibrate and turned the flood layer to standing waves and woke everyone aboard in the same instant with the particular adrenaline of a threat that had no source. Uda was awake before any of them. She was at the starboard rail when Kael came up from the sleeping quarters, and she was looking toward the tower, and the expression on her face was the first time he had seen her look afraid. "What is it?" Reiko said, not a question. "The field is calling me back," Uda said. "It's not." She turned. In the field spike, her material nature was more visible, light moving through her at angles it shouldn't, her edges slightly uncertain. "It's not the Vareth. It's the field. The field wants to close." Mako was already at her instruments. "If the field closes, the bubble ends," Uda said. "Everything that the inversion was holding in place returns to baseline physics, including." She looked at the city, at the floating highways and the fragmented river and 11 years of beautiful, impossible wrong gravity. All of it, at once. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence that all of them knew from different contexts. It was the silence that preceded a decision that had already been made and just hadn't been spoken yet. "How do you close it without that happening?" Kai said. "You can't close it gradually from outside. It has to be regulated from the source. The field has to be walked down, frequency by frequency." She looked at Kael. "The way you'd tune something, you'd need to be at the tower." Kael said. "Yes, you can do that. Regulate it from inside the source. Yes, but it requires full material dissolution. I would need to return completely, not maintain shape." No one said anything, Kael said very carefully. "Define return." She met his eyes. "I don't know," she said. "I've never gone back. I don't know what's on the other side of that." He had known her for 17 days. He had been hearing her for 11 years. He was not sure these were different lengths of time. "There's another option," Mako said. Her voice was doing the controlled thing it did when she was working hard not to have a visible reaction. "If the field can be regulated from inside the source, what if we introduce an external frequency? A counter-resonance? Something that gives the field a new anchor point instead of forcing a close." Uda looked at her. "What frequency?" Mako looked at Kyle. He understood. "Mine. You've been in resonance with the field for 11 years. Your auditory processing architecture you're already a partial anchor point. You've been a partial anchor point since the day it activated." She was pulling up readings now, hands moving fast. "If we could amplify that signal, get you to the source point at the tower, and broadcast your resonance signature at sufficient amplitude, the field might re-anchor to a human-compatible frequency. Instead of closing, it would stabilize permanently at a lower intensity. Gravity would normalize," Kai said. "Partially, over time. The city wouldn't drop, it would settle. Gradually. Like a tide going out." She looked at the readings over years, probably. "And Uta," Kael said. Mako was quiet for a moment. "She's made of the field. If the field re-anchors to your frequency, if it stabilizes around a human signature," she chose her words carefully, "she becomes something different. The field becomes something different. I don't know what that means for her specifically." "It means I stay," Uda said. Not loudly, simply. The way she said most things that were important, as if simplicity was the only container that could hold them. "If the field anchors to him, I stay with the field." Kael had nothing to say about the logic of this. He found he had feelings about the logic that were large and not particularly manageable, but also not particularly relevant to what needed to happen next. What needed to happen next was, get to the tower. Shin looked at his leg. Then he looked at the tower. Then he said, "I can get you to the base. The geometry still works from the southern approach if we go high. Your leg has been worse." He said it flatly, the way he said things he'd already made peace with. "The joints grinding, not failing. Give me the antibiotics when we're back, and it'll be fine. The medical supplies are still in the cache. I know where the cache is. This was true. Shin knew where everything was. 11 years. The approach to the tower took 40 minutes and used everything Kale knew, and some things he'd only learned in the last 17 days. The field spike had destabilized the southern drift corridor, platforms oscillating outside their normal cycles, drift gaps expanding and contracting unpredictably, the flood layer churning in the lower zones. Shin navigated it with the particular economy of someone who had learned to do more with less, his adapted gait more efficient than it had any right to be, the titanium assembly hitting every platform with the precision of long practice. Uda ran with them, and the field moved around her, not for her, around her, as if it was trying to reclaim her and she was maintaining shape through pure refusal. Kale could see it. The edges of her uncertain, the light bending at strange angles, her material coherence visibly taxed by the spike. She was using everything she had to stay present long enough to reach the source. He stayed close to her, not touching. Close. They hit the tower base at 0530, and the sun was not yet up, and the flooded city was spread below them in the gray light, and the inversion field was cycling at full intensity overhead, and the sphere was visible as a distortion in the air above the tower's broken peak. Not an object, a wrongness, the place where the physics ended and something else began. The path to the source was vertical. The tower's interior access had been compromised for years. The structural collapse of the upper third had left the internal stairwells partially blocked, and the exterior was a mesh of accumulated bubbles and 11 years of debris. Navigating it required everything. The drift gaps were centimeter scale. The floating sections of steel framework required timing calculated in fractions of a second. The accumulated bubbles made footing uncertain. Kale went first. Behind him, he heard Uda's breathing change. Shorter, more effortful, the field's pull on her intensifying as they climbed into the source zone. He looked back twice. She nodded both times. Keep going. They reached the source point, the intact section of the tower's core, approximately 40 meters below where the structure had sheared, in 18 minutes. The point was nothing to look at. A section of original steel grating, still solid, at the precise coordinates where Mako's instruments converged. The field was visible here, not as the distortion he'd seen from below, but as texture, the air itself differentiated, stratified, moving in patterns that were almost but not quite like weather. The tone was deafening, not painful, the opposite. It was everything he had been hearing for 11 years resolved into clarity, the way a long-held note finally finds its destination chord. He put his hand on the steel grating, and the resonance ran up through his palm, and he could feel it, his own frequency in there. Buried in 11 years of accumulated signal, small and persistent and specific. Now, he said. Now, Uda said, behind him. She put her hand over his. The feedback was instantaneous and total. His frequency amplified, not through any technology, not through any mechanism he could understand, but through the direct interface between his signature and hers, between the anchor point he'd always been and the field's own structure. The two resonances finding each other and harmonizing and expanding outward through the inversion field in a wave that he felt in his bones and his teeth and behind his eyes. The field didn't close. It breathed. It exhaled. The intensity dropped in a curve that Mako would later describe as almost organic, not a shutdown, a relaxation. The sphere overhead dimmed from a distortion to a shimmer to something almost invisible. Platform oscillations slowed and smoothed. The flood layer calmed to stillness. The city did not fall. It settled, in the gradual way of things yielding to a force they have been fighting for a long time. Kale became aware that he could see his hand clearly, that Uda's hand over his was solid, that the light bending around her had stopped bending. She looked different. Not human different, settled different. As if the things she had been sustaining through effort had become natural. As if the field anchoring to his frequency had given her frequency a place to live that wasn't dissolution. Are you? He started. Still here, she said, not surprised, as if she had known, as if she had calculated it correctly all along, and simply chosen not to say so, in the way that people who have been phenomena rather than persons sometimes know things that persons have to discover. He thought about an 8-year-old boy in a waiting room watching fish. He thought about a tone in the rubble. He thought about 11 years of noise and one person who was made of the thing that had always given him quiet. I'm going to need you to teach me, he said, how to hear it properly. She looked at him with the clear gray eyes. You've been hearing it properly, she said. You just didn't have anyone to listen with. Below them, the bubble city drifted in its strange gravity. The river ran in its 3 levels. The floating highway sections swayed in a breeze that now moved the way breezes were supposed to move. More gently, more honestly, with the first suggestion of a direction that pointed outward instead of in. Shin was waiting at the base when they came down. He was sitting on a section of fallen steel framework with his titanium legs stretched out in front of him and a protein ration bar in his hand, and he looked up at them with the grin of someone who had bet on an outcome and was collecting. "Field's down 40%, Mako's voice said in Kyle's earpiece. Her voice was doing the thing it did when she was trying not to sound like she was crying. Osaka is already transmitting. They want a full debrief. Tell them they can have one, Kai said. He had made the climb to the base level behind them. Kale hadn't known he was following until he heard his voice. In about 6 hours, insisting on. 6 hours, Kai said. Kale sat down next to Shin on the fallen steel. Uda sat on his other side. The space between them was the same space it had always been. The careful distance of something managed. And then it wasn't, because she leaned against his shoulder with the straightforward decision of someone who had calculated a risk and concluded that the number was acceptable. And she was solid, completely, ordinarily solid. He exhaled. It sounded, he thought, like a field settling. The city's going to change, he said, mostly to himself. Yes, Shin said. He looked out at the floating towers and the fragmented river and the sky that was 1 degree less wrong than it had been an hour ago. Slowly. Yeah, everything good does. The tone was still there. It would always be there, reinsured now, a new harmonic, the frequency of a field that had learned a human shape. But it was quiet in the way of something content. And KL was quiet with it, and above them Tokyo was still broken and still beautiful, and was, for the first time in 11 years, becoming something else.